Okay, so I want to thank Chuck Greene for agreeing to do this talk. He is currently the Associate Director for Research and Strategic Planning at Friday Harbor Labs. That's a laboratory associated with the University of Washington. And is there anything else you want to say about who you are at this point, Chuck?
No, I just spent a number of years at Cornell before I decided that I really liked it more on the West Coast. And there were lots of challenges in the world to try to deal with. And what better place to do it than Friday Harbor Labs and the University of Washington?
Okay, well, great. Why don't you take it away talking about algal solutions for a sustainable future?
Yeah, so I'm really pleased to talk to everybody here. I'm going to talk about algae, and I'm going to talk about how algae can be used to tackle two of the most critical problems that society faces, climate change, as well as hunger or human nutrition. And I'm going to really start off from the perspective of climate change, because I'm sure that that's been a recurring theme in the sessions you've had. Let's see. Um, hmm. Okay. So one of the grand challenges of the 21st century is to really balance our global carbon budget. Of the 10 to 11 gigatons of carbon that are emitted into the atmosphere every year, approximately half accumulates in the atmosphere, and the other half ends up nearly split between the oceanic and terrestrial sinks. Um, that extra CO2 accumulating in the atmosphere leads to greenhouse warming, and the extra CO2 accumulating in the ocean leads to ocean acidification. Now, I've been interested in this problem for quite a while now. And back in 2010, we got very interested in looking at what it was going to take to stabilize the atmospheric concentration at 350 parts per million. Now, we're well over 400 now. We were over 350 then, but this was a time when Jim Hansen had said that we really needed to get to 350 to stabilize the atmosphere and the temperature of the atmosphere at a level that was going to be safe for humanity. So we did this paper on geoengineering, highly controversial topic at the time. Um, and basically what we did some modeling to look at a few different scenarios for CO2 emissions to see which ones could stabilize the atmospheric concentration at the end of the century um, at 350 or even lower. And it turned out of all of these different scenarios we looked at, basically we had to reduce CO2 emissions to zero in very short order in order to stabilize at 350 parts per million and to keep the mean global temperature below 2 degrees. Now, the models have changed. In some cases, they've become more sophisticated. So the numbers aren't necessarily exactly the same today that you would get with the models that we got then. But I think the conclusions are the same, that we really are in a bind. And so the message for policymakers, and I think it's as applicable today as it was back in 2010, after evaluating the challenges of stabilizing CO2 at 350, we concluded that society was going to only be able to be successful in meeting this goal by supplementing aggressive greenhouse gas emission reductions with geoengineering. And basically, what we meant by geoengineering, that's any deliberate large scale engineering of the Earth's system to counteract the effects of greenhouse warming and ocean acidification. And there's two general types of geoengineering. The first one, which is the most controversial, is solar radiation management. And that's where you alter the Earth's radiation budget to cool temperatures directly. Now, this is an intervention approach that doesn't change CO2 or the radiative forcing of greenhouse gases, And it also won't help with ocean acidification, but it can keep the planet cooler. A less controversial topic is carbon dioxide removal. And that's where we're extracting CO2 from the atmosphere and storing it elsewhere. Um, it's actually a CO2 remediation approach where we're actually reversing the problem that we've created by adding greenhouse gases. Now we're going to remove them. And by doing this removal of carbon dioxide, it can help address both greenhouse warming and ocean acidification. Now, just show you quick examples of solar radiation management if you haven't seen them yet in this seminar series. But one is where we inject sulfate aerosols into the stratosphere, and that ends up reflecting a lot of the incoming solar radiation. So that's one way of cooling things off. Another way is to potentially do artificial cloud whitening, again, increasing the albedo of the planet so that incoming solar radiation is reflected back into space. I'm not going to talk about solar radiation management. When we first were discussing this in 2010, it was something that nobody really wanted to talk about. Um, because it has a lot of potential problems that can be introduced in the world. But now that we've done very little to actually reduce our emissions in the intervening 14 years, we realize that, yeah, we may actually have to visit this solar radiation management sometime in the not too distant future. But the thing that I'm going to focus on is really this carbon dioxide removal. That's where we extract CO2 from the atmosphere and store it long term, either underground, in the ocean, in the terrestrial biosphere, or in the human built environment. And I'll give you a few examples. This is direct air capture and storage. This is basically where we scrub CO2 out of the atmosphere, usually using some kind of chemistry where basically air runs through and is filtered out. The CO2 molecules are absorbed onto these capturing elements. Then you usually have a temperature swing or some other kind of swing reaction that releases the CO2, and then we inject that into typically a geological repository. Another approach is what's called bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, or BECCS. And in this case, what we do is we use living plants. They may be trees, they may be other kinds of living biomass, where they photosynthesize, take up the CO2, we harvest the biomass, and then we can do things like we can burn it in a power plant, capture the CO2, and then inject that. So we actually can generate electricity um, and use the CO2 for a variety of things. We can, of course, we can pump it underground to sequester it, but we can also use it in a lot of manufacturing processes. And there are some direct air capture facilities, prototype systems that have been built. One is by Global Thermostat, an American company, and another one is Carbon Engineering, a Canadian company that's actually just up the way in British Columbia. Carbon dioxide removal, this is an example where we might have biomass like after we harvest corn, collect the part of the corn that we're interested in eating, and then have the remaining waste biomass. We can burn that, capture the CO2, and then inject it. And of course, I think you've heard some about this, but kind of the newcomer in the carbon dioxide removal game is ocean solutions, looking at ocean-based carbon dioxide removal. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about those today. I don't have that time, but I will point out that two of them do involve algae. One is ocean iron fertilization, and the other one is seaweed cultivation and sinking. Now, the problem that I have with those particular methods is we're doing it out in the ocean, and that means you have to be very careful of what other environmental impacts you're having, and you actually have to monitor and make sure that you're actually capturing and sequestering the carbon before you can get carbon credits for it. And most of these rely on carbon credits to make the economics work out. So that's really, that's a very difficult thing to do out in the ocean. Um, and so I'm not saying that it can't be done. I'm just saying it's a difficult thing to do. Um, you know, what we've focused on, we think that marine microalgae is uh, an incredibly valuable resource and opportunity. And we sort of view this as a hybrid ocean and terrestrial approach. So we've been working for about a little over 15 years looking at algae, marine algae in particular, and looking at ways that we can use algae to solve big problems. Initially, we were funded by Royal Dutch Shell and then the Department of Energy to look at algae um, as a potential biofuel. Turns out that's really not a particularly effective thing to do just because it's so expensive to produce algae and quite honestly, liquid fuels just aren't valuable enough. So we've sort of shifted away from that focus. Um, and but let me get back to what we are actually doing. You can see down in the corner here of this facility. This is the research facility that Royal Dutch Shell funded for us. This is where all of our experimental work was done. These are photobioreactors. I'll talk about those a little bit later. And then these are open raceway ponds. And I'll talk about how those different technologies are used to produce algae. Now, one of the things that is really valuable about growing microalgae on land is that we can monitor it. We know everything that goes into the system. We know everything that comes out. We can verify whatever we do with the products so that we can, you know, if we want to try to get carbon credits, or if we want to figure out ways that we can produce various products that can help store carbon for long periods of time, we have that capability. So that's one of the exciting things about this sort of hybrid approach of growing marine microalgae, but doing it on land. So it sort of checks this monitoring, verification, and reporting box that is very difficult to check for iron fertilization and seaweed harvesting. Now, I've been talking about climate, but one of the things that's really important here is thinking about transforming food production. And if I was an environmental, social, and corporate governance investor looking for the next big thing, then I'd be looking for technological revolutions in food production. Because by 2050, the world's population is projected to increase by 43%, about another 3 billion people. And that'll give us 10 billion people on the planet by 2050. And it's projected that global food production is going to have to increase by greater than 50% to meet the nutritional demands of this growing and increasingly affluent population. So, where are we today? Today's food production system is already unsustainable and it's insufficient, with a quarter of the world's population currently malnourished. So terrestrial agriculture currently provides the backbone of the global food production system today. However, to meet the global food, the global food demand that's projected for 2050 with today's agricultural practices, it would require an additional 600 million hectares, which is 2.3 million square miles of cropland and pasture land. And that would mean we would have to add cropland and pasture land comparable in size to the lower 48 states of the United States. So that's a big area that we would have to now put into agriculture that isn't currently in agriculture. So while terrestrial agriculture is the backbone of today's global food production system, its benefits also come at the expense of having large negative impacts on climate, land use, fresh water, and biodiversity. Thus, by 2050, our global food production system will need to grow substantially while simultaneously reducing its greenhouse gas emissions, as well as its use of arable land and fresh water. This is especially clear when we look at the carbon footprint of agriculture. So if we look at where what the carbon footprint was of our food production system in 2010, it was responsible for about 12 gigatons of CO2, which equivalents, which is about a quarter of our global CO2 emissions. And to get to where we need in order to feed the world in 2050, we'd have to add another 3 gigatons, which is a 25% increase, which would get us up to 15 gigatons of CO2 equivalent emissions. Now, if our goal is to try to meet the 2-degree target agreed to in Paris, we actually have to reduce those emissions by 74%. We have to reduce them by 11 gigatons of CO2 so that we get to 4 gigatons by 2050. And if we want to get to the 1.5-degree stabilization target by 2050, we have to go all the way down to 0. And that means somehow we have to reduce emissions by 15 gigatons of CO2 equivalents from our food production system. So how are we going to even begin to tackle this? So there's a group at Stanford and also at the Stockholm Resilience Institute. There's a number of other groups in the world that are looking at many alternatives to agriculture. So these are what we call the alternative foods of the future. So, notice the color coding, because this is going to come back in future slides. So if we're looking at sort of typical plant-based foods, they're going to be indicated in green. Seafood's going to be indicated by blue, and animal source foods are going to be indicated by red. And then in orange are all these alternative foods that people have been looking at as possibilities. That includes insects, includes kelp, includes algae, includes mushrooms and other kinds of mycoprotein, and cultured meats. Now, expanding the blue foods from aquatic ecosystems is an obvious alternative. The problem, though, is that most wild capture fisheries are already fully exploited or overexploited today, and their scope for growth is pretty limited. In addition, the aquaculture practices that currently focus on finfish and shellfish, in many cases pose environmental problems comparable to those of agriculture. So we think that basically aquaculture, marine aquaculture in particular, needs to shift down the food chain, move away from from finfish rather, and shellfish, and to start looking at algae. And today I'm going to talk about the case for microalgae. Now, this is a different orientation of the slide you saw before. This is the facility growing algae near the Kona Airport on the Big Island of Hawaii. Again, this in the corner was the small research and development facility that we did all of our experimental work at. The raceway ponds are shown over here. The photobioreactors are shown here. This is what the raceway ponds look like. They're open ponds, which means that you can't grow algae in them for a long time. Otherwise, they can get contaminated with other things, either grazers that grow as rapidly as the algae, or other things that can outcompete the algae. So what we do is we initially grow the algae in these closed photobioreactors, and we get the algae up to a concentration that's high enough that we can introduce it into the raceway ponds. The algae are grown out in just 2 days in the raceway ponds, and then we harvest them. So that eliminated the contamination problem which was something that stymied the field for quite a few years. So, there's been commercial development of microalgae in small scale nutraceutical and what I call niche food markets. So, that's okay. There also has been a lot of research put into looking at the use of algae in developing algal biofuels. The problem, though, is that after 50 years of research, it became clear that the microalgae-based biofuels are just not cost competitive in the liquid fuels commodity market. And to really have global impacts, we have to focus on commodity products. We need to focus on things that are sold on very large scales. So fortunately, even though we figured out that that algal biofuels wasn't gonna do the trick for us, we actually didn't realize at the time, but the demand for liquid fuels is going to drop very dramatically by 2050 as we electrify the transportation sector. Right now, it's primarily light vehicles, but a lot of the heavier vehicles by 2050 will also be shifting to electrification, and we will be finding alternatives for marine shipping and aviation. And it's not going to be algal biofuels, but we will be shifting away from fossil fuels. Now, recent experimental and modeling studies have demonstrated that the microalgae are already viable and cost competitive alternatives in the commodity markets for animal feed supplements and also for aqua feeds. By aqua feeds, I mean the feeds that are going into the aquaculture industry. So that's growing shrimp, growing finfish, etc. But the thing that we're most excited about in the largest commodity market for marine microalgae is direct human nutrition. We think that's what's really getting ready to take off. So let's look at the nutritional value of algae. This is an article looking at the potential of future foods. And what I want you to see here is just how nutritionally valuable algae are. So if we look at protein, again, these orange is the alternative foods, green is the plant-based foods, blue is the seafood-based foods, and red is the animal-based foods. And you can see that the algae do pretty well. Maybe not quite as well as some of the other seafoods, but pretty high protein contents. We also see that compared to other things, algae are highly valuable source of omega-3 fatty acids. So for those of you that take, fish oil pills or krill oil pills, you can cut out the middle fish by going directly to algae because that's where the krill and that's where the fish get their omega-3 fatty acids. It's from the algae. In terms of calcium, again, algae are very high in calcium, very high in vitamin A, very high in iron, and very high in vitamin B12. Now, one of the things that's really interesting for those of you that are vegans or vegetarians, you can't get everything that you need nutritionally from an entirely plant-based diet. However, you can get all of the nutritional requirements that you need from an algae-based diet. So that's one of the things that's really worth pointing out. And that's one of the reasons why people add fish meal to animal feeds and aqua feeds, because the animal products, from the fish meal has the essential amino acids and other things that are missing in plant-based diets. But with algae, we can get all of those things without going after fish meal. And I'll mention the consequences of that later on. So let's look at that was the nutritional considerations. Let's look at the environmental sustainability considerations. So relative to terrestrial crops, marine microalgae typically have higher productivities by 1 to 2 orders of magnitude. So if we look at average biomass yields in tons per hectare per year. Look at microalgae down here and look at all these other sources. Here's soy. We're looking at 1 to 2 orders of magnitude higher productivity in microalgae relative to all of these plants. So what that means, if it's 1 to 2 orders of magnitude higher productivity per unit area, in terms of land use, that means they have the potential to provide an equivalent amount of food from less than 1/10 to 1/100th the land area. The other thing we should look at, because marine microalgae don't require soil and irrigation, that means their cultivation doesn't need to compete with agriculture and other stakeholders for arable land or for fresh water. The facilities that we were looking at in Hawaii are in a lava bed and it's a desert. There's less than 10 inches of rainfall there. So you don't need fresh water. You don't need, if you can grow it on a lava bed, you can grow it just about anywhere. In addition, the cultivation of marine microalgae is very efficient in its use of nutrients, only losing those nutrients that are harvested in the desired products. Therefore, the problems associated with excess fertilizer runoff and the subsequent eutrophication of aquatic and marine ecosystems can be avoided. So if we're looking at like the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico, that's because of all the fertilizer runoff in the Mississippi River. And that's because most of the fertilizer that we put on our crops in the Midwest ends up running off into our streams and rivers. So marine algae have low water, carbon, and arable land footprints relative to their major terrestrial sources of human nutrition. And this is just a figure here showing that, for the 1 kilogram produced of beef, chicken, eggs, milk, rice, algae, this is the water footprint, how many liters is needed. This is the CO2 emissions associated with that. And this is the land use associated with that. Now, because the cultivation of marine algae is very efficient in its use of nutrients, only losing those that are harvested in the desired products, the problems associated with the fertilizer runoff and eutrophication can be avoided. So I have this quantitative example here. So when I was a graduate student at the University of Washington, Carl Bonsa was one of my professors. And Carl used to love to show us back of the envelope calculations. And I always took that to heart because I always find it really valuable to do a back of the envelope calculation to sort of see what things mean in the big picture. So what I did here to give us kind of a global perspective is if we look at the global production of soy protein in 2030, it's projected to be 370 million tons per year. And that's from a harvestable area of 1.4 million square kilometers. The microalgae cultivation area required to produce the same amount of protein would be about 14,000 square kilometers. That saves about 95 times as much cropland. In addition, this wouldn't have to be arable land. The freshwater saved globally would be about 160 billion cubic meters of water per year, which is equivalent to the total annual US irrigation demand. And the amount of phosphorus not lost in fertilizer runoff would be 1.6 thousand tons per year. And that's equivalent to about 3.2% of the annual North American fertilizer demand. So these numbers just kind of give you a sense of, the environmental benefits of being able to grow microalgae in terms of reducing the land, fresh water, and fertilizer footprints of our current terrestrial agricultural systems. So what does this all mean in the big picture? So in addition to this paper in oceanography that we put out a couple of years ago, we also put out this paper in PLOS biology, which sort of was emphasizing transforming marine aquaculture from the bottom up, meaning let's look at algae as a potential source of world nutrition and in comparison to things further up the food chain. Now, one of my graduate students, Selena Scott Buechler, did this really nice thesis a couple of years ago. And what she did is she did a GIS study looking at the algal biomass productivity kind of on a global basis. Now, this particular map is primarily driven by the availability of solar radiation. It doesn't have all of the constraints. I will show you the next map, which constrains it to a more realistic picture of where you can grow algae. But the reason I show this figure here is it really shows that the place to be growing algae is in the tropical parts, between the Tropic of Cancer and the Tropic of Capricorn. 20 degrees north, 20 degrees south. What that means is that the place to grow marine microalgae is basically in the global south. Now, the global breadbaskets currently are in the global north. We are dependent on what gets produced in North America and in Eurasia. But now we have an opportunity to produce a really valuable source of nutrition in Latin America, in Africa, in India, in Southeast Asia. We don't usually consider Australia part of the global South, socioeconomically, but in terms of its geography, it is, and it's a great place to grow algae as well. But now let's sort of take in some other factors. And what we realize is that, we can't really grow it in the middle of the continents. If you're going to be growing marine microalgae, you have to be doing it pretty close to the coast, because otherwise the expense of transporting seawater, becomes limiting. And you also need to look at things like, obviously, you need the land to be relatively flat. You're not going to do it in a coastal mountain range. So there's all sorts of other factors that Selena built into her GIS. And what she was left with was this relatively thin ribbon of land in the same areas, latitudinally, but along the coasts. And you look at this and you say, well, that doesn't look like very much. And it isn't a lot land-wise, but it turns out that we can produce all of the protein that the world would need in 2050, just in the areas shown on this map. So I'm not saying that we're going to produce all of the world's food demand or its protein demand in 2050 from algae. I'm just saying that the potential is there. So in terms of addressing global challenges, the large-scale industrial cultivation of marine microalgae onshore can provide the protein necessary to feed a global population approaching 10 billion people. It can reduce terrestrial agriculture's demand for arable land and fresh water, thereby reducing the pressure for deforestation and its associated greenhouse gas emissions, as well as reducing terrestrial biodiversity loss. It can account for a total reduction of up to a quarter to 1/3 of the annual global CO2 emissions by 2050, again, by moving away from the way we currently produce food based on terrestrial agriculture. And I'm going to talk about this more from this point on. It can lead to a number of innovative options for carbon dioxide removal, from the production of carbon negative products to much more sustainable algae-based approaches for carbon dioxide utilization and storage associated with direct air capture and with bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. Like I said, I will be talking more about that in a few minutes. It can reduce agriculture's fertilizer runoff and the subsequent eutrophication of freshwater and marine ecosystems. And as I mentioned before, it can contribute to feed production for the aquaculture industry for finfish and shellfish, and therefore reduce the demand for fish meal, which currently accounts for about 30% of the global wild-caught fish harvest. It turns out that for every 1 pound of fish that we produce through aquaculture, it requires 10 pounds of wild-caught fish meal. So that's not a very good ratio. So again, we're going to now look at this, these other options for carbon dioxide removal. So if we're looking at a system where we're growing algae to produce a whole variety of products from carbohydrates for ethanol, proteins for, for animal feeds, aqua feeds, and for humans, and oil that you could potentially use in biodiesel or jet fuel, but it's difficult to see a good value proposition on that. But there are a lot of other valuable products, bioplastics and biopetroleum-based products. Turns out that a group in Germany is producing producing carbon fiber from algae. So imagine the opportunities here to potentially lock away carbon in these high value products. So when we grow the algae, we need sunlight, we need nutrients, we need seawater. We also need CO2. Now you might wonder, well, isn't there enough CO2 in the atmosphere? Well, the problem is the algae, when they're growing in these ponds, these open ponds, they take up CO2 so rapidly that it doesn't diffuse through the air-water interface fast enough. So we actually need to inject CO2 into it. Now, the way everybody thought about it in the old days when Royal Dutch Shell was funding us was, well, we'll get the CO2 from the power plants, you know? And the problem with that is it doesn't really solve the CO2 emissions problem. I mean, basically what it means is you'll get um, one more cycle of that CO2 before it ends up in the atmosphere. Because most of these, I mean, yeah, so most of these things, if you're producing, animal feeds, if you're producing energy, you know, they're not locking up CO2. So you're really not solving the climate problem. So we started to look at ways that we could combine algal biomass production with other ways of getting the CO2. So one would be direct air capture. So you cut the power plant out of it and basically put in something like the global thermostat, direct air capture approach. And now it turns out that you can capture a lot of CO2. It's an expensive way to go. Turns out we can sequester most of that CO2 that's captured, and what we need can go into the algae. It's a relatively small amount, but the production of the algae now provides a source of revenue to help offset some of the costs associated with direct air capture. And of course, you need to get a source of power, preferably from renewables. The other approach is that you can keep the power plant, but rather than burning fossil fuels in it, you could potentially burn biomass. So this is kind of a bioenergy with carbon capture and storage approach. And then you could capture the CO2 from that power plant, sequester some of it, and provide the remainder to the algae. And you could also do that with macroalgae. If people are growing seaweeds out in the ocean, you can collect those, or actually even algae that washes ashore could be used in this manner. Now we did a thought exercise of integrating algae with bioenergy, carbon capture and storage, and did this paper in Earth's Future. And I'm just going to sort of summarize what we found. So what we did in this example, we said, okay, let's take 2,800 hectares of soy cropland and let's replace it by an integrated ABEX system where 96% of that cropland, which is 2,680 hectares, is basically used to grow eucalyptus. Now, we did this example of eucalyptus because there's a lot of eucalyptus growing in Hawaii. It's an invasive, but they planted it. And only 120 hectares, only 4%, we could grow the marine algae in. And we can, use the eucalyptus to fire the power plant, and that provides the marine algae production facility with the required CO2, as well as the electricity that we need. And it turns out that this integrated 2,800 hectare ABEX system produces as much protein and it's much higher quality than the soy cropland, but it doesn't increase the land or freshwater demand, and it generates 61.5 terajoules of electricity. So, you know, what we did I tried to put this in perspective by looking at the total electricity demand in Brazil and the sequestration of CO2 emissions in Brazil. And it's one of these facilities, one of these 2,800 hectare facilities would only be able to take out about 0.008% of Brazil's total industrial electricity demand and 0.006% of Brazil's total CO2 emissions. But again, back of the envelope calculations, if we had 1,000 of these ABEX systems, we could produce 8% of Brazil's total industrial electricity demand while negating 6% of Brazil's total CO2 emissions. And at the same time, we're producing food. So that's the value added by growing algae in this, in combination with something like, in this case, eucalyptus, but you could do it with any other terrestrial plant that makes sense. You could do it with marine seaweeds. So where's the future? Well, the future, as John Doerr would say, is in speed and scale. So we started off with this experimental facility in 2009 that Royal Dutch Shell was kind enough to pay for. And then we worked with the Sahara Forest Project to build a demonstration facility in 2012 at the COP meetings in Qatar. And currently, we're working with the Brazilians to produce a new, larger demonstration commercial facility in the largest port in South America near Rio de Janeiro. And our initial facility will be about 15 hectares, but there's literally thousands of hectares available to us once we demonstrate that we can make this profitable and can scale it up. So that, in a nutshell, is what I have to offer. One final thing before I entertain questions, if we have time to entertain questions, is I just wanted to mention I'm organizing a marine heat waves, a workshop at Friday Harbor this coming summer at the last 2 weeks in August. It's a training workshop primarily aiming for graduate students and postdocs from around the world. Let me note that everybody that's coming will have a fully paid scholarship. So you get yourself to Friday Harbor and all the costs are covered. Now, I mentioned this to you a little bit late. We've already got 50 applications for 15 slots, but if there's some really good graduate students and postdocs out there, we're still looking at new applications and, for another week. And then we're going to start making the hard decisions. But anyway, I wanted to put that in front of you folks at UW, just so in case you hadn't heard about it by now you know. So that's all I've got for today, and I'm happy to answer questions if we can do that.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you very much, Chuck. So you can type your questions into the chat, or I can unmute you and you can ask your questions if you raise your hand. Yeah, Bill, let me unmute you. Okay, wait a second, Bill. I'm asking to unmute you. Can you go ahead and unmute?
Okay.
There you go.
Okay, thanks. That was very nice, Chuck. I now understand a lot of the potential for inshore, onshore, all the advantages that you have with that in sorting out the problem of how to sink a lot of carbon. Nature sinks it mostly through the production of marine algae and dumping it into the deep ocean where there's already so much that the additional would be about 2% addition. But in figuring out how to do that, how to fertilize the surface, you basically have to pump up missing nutrients that fell below the thermal.
Yep.
So that's fine, you pump them up, but it brings CO2 with it.
Yep.
And so you have to pump down at the same time enough CO2 or potential CO2 to make it work, and then about 100 times more. The question I have, I mean, besides how to power this, and we can talk about that sometime. But this is the way that nature has sunk a lot of CO2 on a time scale of decades that might make a difference to us. I never engaged with the problem of what happens when you do high CO2, high biomass production in a system like that, which is perhaps grown inside of a donut, or a fence of some sort. The problem, I think, is getting your sinking method, whether it's a pipe or something else, to do it before the photosynthesized CO2 that's in the plant mass, of being able to sink that before it turns into CO2 that can escape.
Yeah. So Chuck, why don't you answer him? We have another question in chat after you answer.
Well, my question is simply, we could talk about this later, but is there anything about this kind of production system that you see as a carryover from the onshore stuff?
So I think we could grow seaweeds and macroalgae on land the same way we're growing microalgae. And what I like about these systems is that they're closed. We know we can do the complete budget of what's coming in and what's going out. Whereas if you do this work out in the open ocean, you have all sorts of issues. Like you said, getting them the nutrients is a tough nut to crack. But there's also the potential of stripping nutrients out in one part of the ocean, and those nutrients are normally advected to other parts of the ocean, and so there's real
like
potential
phosphorus
for remote impact. So I kind of like the idea of having, a really good understanding of what's coming in and what's going out. So that's why my colleagues that were working on this were mostly oceanographers and mostly seagoing oceanographers. And we realized, one, it's difficult to build infrastructure out in a hostile environment like the ocean. And, we can do a lot of this stuff on non-arable land. We can do it in the deserts of the world.
I agree.
So we have So we have a question on that. Well, first of all, what kind of social pushbacks have you experienced?
We haven't really. I think it's because we haven't, gone to a large scale yet. I mean, we can do this work in desert environments, and I can imagine, desert environments have biodiversity too. So, just like any other things that humans build, there are going to be people that are going to be concerned that you're going to do some kind of environmental damage. And that's a legitimate concern. I guess the way I like to think about it is anything that humans do is going to have an impact, and you have to sort of weigh the costs and benefits and decide, if the benefits outweigh it, then you do it, right? but you're always going to have people that are going to say, no, but you know, you're putting this and this at this and that at risk. And so, you know, we haven't tried to scale things up in a big way yet, but I'm sure that the moment we do, there will be issues. But we're pretty careful. You know, in Hawaii, you have to be really careful. You can't bring microorganisms in and out of Hawaii, and that includes algae. So, you know, there's a lot of rules. You know, there's also, you know, a lot of people say, well, let's use genetically modified microalgae. And in Hawaii, they don't like, you know, genetically modified organisms. And the same is true in Europe. So we've stayed away from that. You know, but those are the only real things that we've even, you know, even have been brought up in discussion. Um, because the reality is there's so many environmental benefits compared to what we're doing now that it's pretty hard to argue against um, trying this. I mean, you know, we're in the midst of the largest uncontrolled experiment in human history, right? Putting in lots of CO2 into the atmosphere and methane and a variety of other greenhouse gases. We don't have any controls on that. So it's like, let's 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 turn our attention to reducing those
Yeah.
things rather than you know focusing on the potential problems that carbon dioxide removal
So we
might
have,
introduce.
yeah, we have a question from Katie Webb.
Uh-huh.
What are the types of jobs available in marine algae production? Lots of complicating factors, I'm sure, but if terrestrial agriculture is partially replaced by microalgae production, what is the predicted ratio of new jobs to job loss?
You
What
know,
is
I,
skill level training that would be required for these jobs in microalgae production?
they're going to be a lot of skilled workers. They're not, there's going to be fewer, you know, but when you, let's look at agriculture on the kind of scale we're talking about. I mean, you know, have you ever looked at a modern farm, right? Where you know, you have remote controlled, um, you know, uh, all the planting, all the harvesting is done by, you know, remotely controlled tractors now, right? So you know, we don't have a lot of people, you know, out in the fields harvesting the things that are really the big commodity products. You know, it's on the much smaller scale things. I mean, we still have people, you know, out in the fields, you know, for certain things. But yeah, it's going to impact that. There's no question, but everything that we do that involves technology has that potential. So it's going to produce, you know, potentially better paying jobs. It's going to be introducing jobs in the global South, which is an incredibly important opportunity. A lot of people say, whoa, you know, you're looking at really unstable parts of the world when you're talking about the global South. Why would you put an industry there? But the reason why those parts of the world are unstable is because basically the climate's changing on them and they're not able to produce the food that they need. And people are leaving the countryside, going into the urban cities. And, you know, it's become a disaster. That's probably one of the main uh, socio-political things that led to the Arab Spring, you
Yeah.
know. So uh,
Okay. We have one more question in the chat from KL. How long until algae is more widely used grown for the growing population and CO uptake, do you think?
So I'm really excited about what happened in the last 5 years with companies like Impossible Foods, because I realized, oh, you know, people are open to the idea of plant-based substitutes for meat. Um, and it's still expensive, but when it scales up, the prices can be comparable. And especially if people start to uh, if the producers have to, pay something for their carbon emissions associated with that food production. So I think that there is a market out there. We're going to face the same problems that those plant-based, food substitute companies face. There's an entrenched industry out there that will do everything it can to keep its market share, saying all sorts of nasty things about what might happen. But I'm pretty confident that we can come up with really good algae-based substitutes, which will be nutritionally superior to the plant-based substitutes, will taste really good and have the potential to having a significant impact on, on the meat markets, particularly beef, and also on dairy. And I'm working with a company now that's developing algae-based dairy substitutes. So things like cheeses, yogurts, things like that. It turns out dairy has a very high carbon footprint. Not quite as bad as beef, but number two, and trying harder. So yeah, so I think there's lots of opportunities. And one of my last graduate students was working for a while for Impossible Foods. So we had a little bit of an insider track to see what was going on in that company, and what sorts of headwinds it was facing, and what the opportunities were, and what the threats were.
Yeah, great. So thank you so much. That was super interesting. I learned a ton. And yeah, some thank yous in the chat. And I want to remind the students to participate in the seminar reflection in Canvas. Don't forget to do that. You have like an hour to do that. And thanks. I wish we could applaud. I can applaud for you, but anyway, thank you. I learned so much.
So any of the students, if you make it up to Friday Harbor, in the coming months, let me know. And if you're interested in this, happy to talk to you in person. And if you want to, send me an email with questions, happy to answer those as well.
Yeah. If you haven't spent time in Friday Harbor, you should. It is really a special place. So thanks so much, Chuck.
Sure. Okay. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.